It's Ruadhán, and I thought I'd do something a little different today. Not just the fact that I'm in my bedroom and you can see my wall of posters behind me, where almost everything, except for the little art pieces, that one, which my friend Alexis did. These are all things I've been to, at least been to. A few of them are even things that, anything here? Let's see, that was where I DJ'd first time. I was an alternate at this event for DJs. So yeah, I did Mod Revival, Britpop, and 80s British Ska. And then there's another one. It's out of the view. Whatever. But yeah, the rest is all things I've been to, like I said, except for art pieces. And, oh, there's Ruadhán. So, today, I'm doing a novel, review, video book report sort of thing. Technically, I'm not finished, but I'm at the, at this point where I'm at, I gotta say, it's kind of predictable how it's going to end, but I'm enjoying it. And then there's, this appendix in the back with brief histories on the world built within it. So, because I'm going on script, and hopefully I can read the tiny, tiny print behind me, or behind the phone camera. So I got all pretty for you all, and I've even got some music in the background. This is her album Somnambulistic Romance. First let me mention that this is actually the first edition of the first trilogy of the WRAETHTHU series, a series of 3 trilogies, the WRAETHTHU Chronicles, of which this has the enchantments of flesh and spirit, the bewitchments of love and hate, and the fulfillments of fate and desire. And as we said, I'm almost done with the last book in the trilogy, and then there's the appendix. And then there's the WRAETHTHU histories, and then there are the WRAETHTHU Mythos novellas written by Storm Constantine, and there are also is also an ever-growing series of short story collections with at least 1 or 2 selections per book by Storm Constantine herself, and most are written by fans, and she's been very enthusiastic in supporting the fan community for the WRAETHTHU series. And there's also a couple of novels by other authors, at least one of which either it was never in print in the first place, either it never went to print as planned in 2008, or it fell out of print. Either way, I would like some more information about what happened to Rosamundi by Chris Dotto. Is this out of print? Was it ever actually fully in print? If it was in print and then fell out of print, can I get a copy from you? That would be nice. And there's also a... God damn it. How do I turn off the notifications on Windows 10? I don't want these in my thing. Guess I could just turn off the music, but that would be silly, right? That would make some semblance of sense. There's also been a series of non-fiction pagan books set up around to the system of magic and mythology within the series. So this has even, influenced a lot of fans' spirituality. Plus there's a picture book from a German LARP back in, I want to say 2006. And then there's the infamously panned RPG. And there's some history that I've looked into on why the RPG was, for starters, it was it plays on a lot of LGBT themes that obviously turned off a lot of RPG reviewers when it was first published in 2004. But aside from, anything, world-related, related to the world of the WRAETHTHU that was present in the RPG, a lot of the problems with the RPG game design itself, there's some history on that I know little bits and pieces. Some is rumor, some seems very credible. I would like to find out a little bit more, but basically it sounds like the RPG was originally written as, was originally intended to be a guide for writing WRAETHTHU stories. So basically a fan fiction guide of sorts. And then, behind the scenes nonsense happened, and it turned into an RPG, which, didn't necessarily have the best gameplay design, and then, of course, the fact that the setting just turned off a lot of reviewers just outright. And I mentioned systematic. So this is one of the few, what I would consider one of the few true examples of, massive world building in the fantasy genre. I would honestly put Storm Constantine's abilities toward world building, to the point that, again, it has inspired, a fan community that has always been very, very dedicated, and which she's greatly encouraged. I would probably put her abilities at world building on par with J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is massive world building. It's got its own history, and I'd put her on the level of Lovecraft with mythology building as well, and world building, and he definitely has his own mythos within his books, and was corresponding with other writers. There was, again, more world building within the Lovecraftian mythos. So I would easily compare her abilities at world building to Lovecraft, Tolkien. So she's very skilled at this, and one thing I also do want to say is that she has said that the WRAETHTHU stories have been based on, it was initially inspired by a series of incredibly vivid dreams that she describes as having had virtually all her life. I think she said the first one she ever wrote down, she was born 1956, I believe, and she said the first one she ever wrote down, which I think was only later published in another collection of hers, was she initially wrote it down in 1973, and the first book in this volume didn't get published until 1986, I believe. 86, 87. So, we've got massive world building that she says has been, based on, incredibly vivid dreams she's had virtually all her life. She's been writing stories about this world since she was about 16 years old, and she also has a background in chaos magic and ancient Egyptian mythology, which does come out in its own ways within the writings. The quick perusal I've taken through the first book in the what's it called? The pagan magic system. She does also borrow from the ceremonial magic and Wiccanate sort of formula. For building rituals and holidays, but again, you see, bits where, the introduction, describes this as being clearly based on chaos magic. So this has also influenced her writing. And as I said, this is the first edition of these stories. And the stories are now in their third edition. I'm sorry this is going to be such a long introduction here. But, so the stories are now in their third edition. They were revised once in 2003 and 4, I think, was the course where these were published, republished over 2 years. So they were first revived in 2004, the final book revised and published in 2004, with an omnibus published in 2007, and then they have been reissued again earlier this year. So the first revisions were made to line up some of the details better with the WRAETHTHU Histories trilogy, which was published in 2000. So, she made some adjustments, just, some revisions, but it's essentially the same story, which is why I'm starting, with this, and it is my hope to do a comparative review of every edition, of the revisions. So, she revised it once in 2004 to line them up with the events of the WRAETHTHU Histories, which, to my understanding, basically each volume of the WRAETHTHU Histories, and this is the first book, follows the same events of each book in the WRAETHTHU Chronicles, which is the first trilogy, but it's from third person versus first person. And then the newer edition, the third editions that they're now in, have been again revised to line things up with the now expanded, world building between herself and the fans. And I'm going to link to a very useful interview that I found, wherein she explains the way that she and a handful of and a small handful of fans worked on building the system of magic together. So this is now becoming, a bit more of a concise sort of mythology that she's building with this. So, as I said, the first 3 books in the first trilogy are the Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit, which was published in 1987. That's what I wrote. I said 87, right? Or did I say 86? I don't know. The Bewitchments of Love and Hate from 1988, and The Fulfillments of Fate and Desire from 1989. So, some background on the world of these stories is in much of which is covered in the first volume of the trilogy. Humankind is on its way out, and the first book begins after what's presumably a series of battles between humans and the new species, the WRAETHTHU, who were first born from a mutation of humans. They look superficially similar to human males, but tend to be taller, leaner, stronger, somewhat androgynous to varying degrees, as it is described. Each character does, look unique. Taller, leaner, stronger, somewhat androgynous in the facial features, again, to varying degrees, very little to no body hair, and they tend to heal more quickly and efficiently than the human body, and most importantly, they are, hermaphroditic, and this is the word she uses. She explains her reasoning in the introduction to the first book of the magic system. She is aware that it's considered a taboo term in intersex communities. She's not relating it to real-life intersex people. She's relating it to a system of ceremonial and ritual magic. Please get off my dick about this, because, I'm using the words the author uses. So, most importantly, they're hermaphroditic, possessing internal organs that can both impregnate and, carry an offspring. And this, it's described within the book. There is a very poor video review of this elsewhere on YouTube. I'm not even going to link it. You can search it yourself. She even admits that she didn't even finish the first book of the trilogy. You know, it is explained that, you know, it sort of shape shifts in a way, and makes most people, you know, say, oh, it's like an anemone. I'm like, no, it says in the book, you know, the floral comparison that she makes is an orchid, not a sea anemone. I don't know where people got that from. I really don't. It's evidence that they've never actually read this. And it's also noteworthy that only human males can be incepted into the WRAETHTHU species through a, you know, process of blood magic, and they are also, you know, innately adept to magics, including telepathy and pyrokinesis. Telepathy especially plays a huge role in especially the second and third stories in the first trilogy. It also stands apart from most other fantasy series that I'm familiar with, at least, especially the most famous ones, which are based on a very 19th, early 20th romanticized ideal of chivalrous medieval Europe and heraldry and all that. Like, even Princess Bride is loosely based on this. This instead is based on a relatively post-apocalyptic future where the culture of the WRAETHTHU seems based on late 19th, early 20th century Bohemian cultures. There are tribes who, you know, are described in what in early 21st century terms would be, you know, considered like fairly, you know, punk rock looking, you know, certain pagan subcultures, you know, in the US. So it's modern, but, you know, it's very much a modern futuristic world, but in a post-tech where even WRAETHTHU technology is powered through their system of magic. So if you follow me on Goodreads, which I don't think anybody on YouTube currently does, or at least, like, nobody I'm aware of, you've got me, you know, as a private, you know, you've hidden your subscription, so I don't know. But if you go look at my Goodreads page, which I can link below, if I don't, by the time I upload this, just please remind me, you'll see that I've actually been working on this for a very long time. And it's not because it's about 800 pages long, but more for the fact that enchantments, so the first book in the trilogy, it's a bit dull. It's a bit dull. And the second and third books of the trilogy, so, as I said, these are all written from the first person and perspective of the primary character of each, which is a different primary character each novel. So, I chalk up my less than enthusiastic read of the Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit to the fact that I just don't like Pelaz. I really don't. He's impeccably devoid of personality, and for this reason, I'm really curious how the revised editions treat this. Like, you know, this is another reason I'm really hoping to do, you know, get a hold of the second edition, and you know, eventually the third editions, because I really want to see how she, you know, tweaks Pelaz's writing style, because in the first edition of Enchantments, he's dull. He's dull. I wouldn't say whiny, as the other reviewer on YouTube said, but just dull. Just dull. Just dull, and there is an in-story reason he comes off as completely devoid of personality. At least within the first couple books, he gets a little bit more toward the end of the final one, but, he's also being seen through somebody else's eyes, so, he's just dull. He's just dull. I've got another friend who doesn't like Pelaz, for other reasons, so I'm hoping that the revised edition, bring this up. So, the first story follows Pelaz, from when he first meets Calanth, who tends to go by Cal in the books, who brings him to a WRAETHTHU settlement for Inception. Inception is, the blood magic where, a human male can become WRAETHTHU. It is important that women cannot be incepted, but this gets addressed in the third book. And the pair then, travel, encounter other tribes to help Pel ascend the magical caste system to the midpoint of their caste system, at which point he dies and becomes separated from Cal, but he's writing the story from the third person, so obviously, he is, resurrected through means which, by the end of the third book, remain shrouded in mystery. This will hopefully be addressed in the third-person perspective of the WRAETHTHU histories. So much of the story following his rebirth sees him traveling across the continent. I've forgotten the name, but it's based on Western Europe. And eventually ending in the city of Emanion and the Palace of Fionica, and there's some resistance from others in the political council for Thady, the character who incepted Pelaz, but again, it is fairly predictable from about that point on, but again, this is pretty much setting up for the next two books. Again, the first book in the first trilogy, it's not great, but it's not terrible either. I just found the character telling the story to be generally devoid of personality about 90% of the time, and the other 10%, a little bit of an ass. The world building, on the other hand, fully fleshed out. Everybody else I can imagine very vividly, as the character of Pel is describing them. I can't, I can still barely envision Pel being seen through another character's eyes. He's just dull. The second book, Bewitchments of Love and Hate, follows Swift, who's a pureborn WRAETHTHU, which was very interesting to see. And, we very briefly meet him in the first book as a toddler at about the age of 6 months old, who is, assumed by Pel and Calanth, who were formerly human. At first they think he looks about 2.5. So this is to, so the second book really illustrates, though it has less to do with the story of the third than the story in the first book does. But it really contributes to the world building in the WRAETHTHU series, in that we see the coming of age rituals into, when you're not incepted into the species of the WRAETHTHU, but more like, you come of age within the magical caste system, and, instead, and, we see, how childhood is expected. At about 7 years old, he is physiologically and psychologically about where a human 13-year-old would be. So, we see they age fairly fast, but, are fairly long-lived, which kind of goes against what most other species of mammals on the planet go through. Usually it's, the slower you age, the longer you live. And, we also, the third story mainly tackles the war between the tribe led by Swift's father and the Galaming, who is the tribe that Pell was ultimately aligned with by the end of the first book. And how this is going to bring a, new, alliance between the tribes, and there is, of course, resistance from, Swift's original tribe, and it ends, I'm sorry, very brief spoilers, but again, like the first one, it seems, it was a little less predictable, but you figure out where this is going, before well before you get there. So, he does end up usurping his father's role as leader of the tribe to the point of just, beginning anew. And the third book follows Calanth, who we see, who is the only prominent character to feature in the other two as well. So the timeline is fuzzy when it begins, and it begins sometime after Calanth left the events of Book 2. All we know is that, it just kind of begins at some point after that. Even when we are caught up to speed, it's very vague on the passage of time, and this is within character. It becomes very clear that this is well within character. What we learn of Cal's personality through the second book, and what we continue to learn of him through the third, is that he's fairly chaotic by WRAETHTHU standards. So, where Pell and, to a lesser extent, Swift, in the previous two books, embrace their fates and in their own ways, and the roles that they've been, selected to play, in the fate of their race, by which we mean, a distinct species from humans. Storm Constantine is British, so she uses race differently than Americans do. Cal is a fighter. Cal's main, mission is to fight fate until he can't. Until he just learns to accept it. So, through the earlier books, it said that order and stoic control over emotion is the epitome of what WRAETHTHU should strive for. We learn from the sister race that evolved from women that the WRAETHTHU need this chaos and darkness to survive, and ultimately for their race to ascend to what, their purpose. So, now some personal thoughts. Though I'd been aware of Storm Constantine as an author since I want to say the mid-90s, so shortly after this was published in Omnibus, I had kind of skipped over a handful of the interviews with her in the handful of goth fanzines that they'd been published in, like Propaganda, and I believe Ghastly had a prominent interview with her once or twice. I'd actually first become aware of the ins and outs of the series via RPGNet, which I'm kind of embarrassed by now. Again, this was through the, infamously panned RPG, and So the impression that I had for a couple years was less than favorable because, in all honesty, as a published novelist myself, I can consciously and logically know that. So what we write is as much a product of our environment as it is of ourselves. On the other hand, I remained curious because, as a pagan, I also feel that the characters we write guide us through the stories as spiritual entities, on some plane, some of whom might even be, divine, as I feel the more and more I read this. There is, a concrete revealed mythology I'm picking up out of this, even though Storm herself, relates a very different relationship she has with it. So these stories were written in the mid-'80s in the UK when HIV and AIDS were pretty much all over the newspapers, and gay men were especially scapegoated for the spread and demonized left and right. So when these books came out, in 1987, 88, and 89, the first one especially being, about, a young man who was, kidnapped, but, technically he ran away. But you can see where people, would, get unfavorable ideas about how this parallels what was going on at the time and what, conservative journalists were saying, at the time. So, in fact, when Pelaz introduces us in the first book to the concept of WRAETHTHU, in his own words, he uses, terms like, abducting, the boys of the house, stealing the teenage sons in the middle of the night, and, of the neighboring villages. And believe me, I can understand the criticisms based on allegations of homophobia, because, let's face it, there are still enough homophobes on both sides of the Atlantic who think that same-gender attractions aren't innate, but instead groomed into young people via sexual predators, and that no shortage of those predators spread blood-borne diseases. Again, when you're human, you're incepted into WRAETHTHU via blood magic. So, if you think about it too much, it sounds really, really cringy, and because it seems an odd choice of story to publish in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis, if one wishes to avoid, being accused of homophobic sympathies. So, which, she's repeatedly stated, she's very, pro-LGBT. In fact, her books have been used, in conversations about, sexuality and gender in science fiction and fantasy. So, on the other hand, once you actually get into the stories, you realize it's deeper and more philosophical and, magic-oriented than, the easy read of, gay metaphor. Travel also plays a very prominent role, typically by foot or by horse, and themes of fate, fighting society, fighting oneself, love, and redemption weave throughout each book in various amounts. I've also seen allegations that the stories are somehow misogynistic, but honestly, as someone of a male gender, albeit very effeminate and very, very fabulous, and considering that the author is herself a woman, unless it's either really obviously so or presented in a way that has been explained to me before, I'm not going to see it. I don't see it. Somebody's going to have to carefully explain how this is misogynistic, because I don't see it. I really don't. What I did see was a handful of characters who are disparaging towards femininity and the female side of their species, but these characters are obviously being painted in less favorable ways. Swift's father, had to be usurped, and his tribe, dismantled and reborn under, his son, in part because, his father, is the leader of the tribe, and this tribe was known for, being, very suppressive of their, of the feminine in their spirits and their self and their bodies. In fact, it's a plot point, or more exactly, or more precisely, a world-building point that Terzian, Swift's father, his consort Cobweb, is very effeminate, but all of the effeminate members of the Var tribe were defectors from other tribes, who may possibly have been acquired in dubious ways into the Varb tribe. So, again, this is... It doesn't read as misogynistic to me, taken in context of the rest of the story. And so, when the Camagrian, the sister tribe, make their role in the story known by the third book, they do make it clear that, the feminine is necessary for the survival of the WRAETHTHU, and all of, what humanity considered feminine, entails, the good and the bad, qualities that, humans before the WRAETHTHU, would consider feminine. So, and the final common criticism that I really want to address is, and this just boils down to a matter of taste. So you'll either like it or not, you'll either enjoy the stories or not based on this fact alone. So Constantine has an especially gothic writing style in all that implies. She draws from occult themes. It can get fairly dark and introspective. And most importantly, her prose is quite lush and verbose. And I'm going to make a comparison to, PZ Bright. So when a Bright character, merely enters a room that smells like incense and the bowl of fruit on the table, Storm's characters waft into the room, or waft into the space, and that has tendrils of vanilla cones curling around their olfactory senses, and they taste blackberries and currants before they even notice the bowl itself pouring over onto the table. And so, while I find that style of, they call it purple prose, I find it very hard to write myself, but I find it very easy to become absorbed in as soon as I like the characters. And honestly, Pell, each book is written as, a memoir of its main character. It's presented as a memoir of its main character, and Pell doesn't do that very much. Swift does that a little more so. Cal does it all over the place. Cal, everything is a metaphor for, and a simile. He he can't write straightforward if he tried, and it is also noteworthy that Storm has created language within the WRAETHTHU, and at least in this edition, again, I have to get the second edition books. So, there is a glossary in the back of this, so, so we've got a glossary of, WRAETHTHU language, terms, and, some of the more minor characters, so I really question why she considers a couple of these characters minor, and others, it's just matter of fact. There are appendices on, WRAETHTHU, magical caste system, biology. There's a very sizable, we've got about 13 pages of the history of the 12 tribes of the final continent, which seems based on Asia from what I've figured out. So that is very useful, and I hope it does follow into the omnibus edition of the second volume, or the second edition omnibus. So, on the whole, I found it fairly enjoyable, at least after I got through the first book. And I honestly intended to find myself an omnibus edition of the first. I do honestly find. I honestly intend to find myself an omnibus edition of the first revision to compare and see if I can get more into Pelaz. Because, as I said, I did find his story, which is unfortunately the first to be the biggest drag in the whole first trilogy. It did take me longer to get through Swift's than through Cal's, but I think that had more to do with the circumstance of how I read, and lately I do most of my reading on the bus, because I'm spending at least an hour and a half round trip to the Ann Arbor Public Transit station, which is right by my post office, and I live in downtown Ypsilanti, and so we're looking at about 40 to 45 minutes each way, just to pick up my mail. And unfortunately, while I was getting through Swift's book, I was having a much busier time than I've been having lately, where I had to, basically, put down the book to get off the bus, or there were times when it was, barely 10 minutes that I'd be on the bus, and that's not really enough time for me to read much, because if I get into it, I could miss my stop, and, I can't let that happen, so, again, it took me it's one of the things that takes me the longest time to finish, but I'm really glad I did, and I've chalked up, a significant part of that to the fact that, the character narrating the first book is just dull. He's just dull. I found Swift far more engaging, by a very wide margin, and Cal, my friend who hates Pelaz for other reasons really loves Cal, and I'm just Cal is his little dumpling, and I'm like, I enjoy Cal, but he's too much like myself for me. I think he's too much like myself for me to think of him as like my little dumpling or something. He's a bit all over the place. He's a mess. He's a hot mess, and I'm like, I can relate to that, but I don't want to build strong feelings toward it, because, just because I can relate to it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean I think that highly of him as a person. It's horrible, it's horrible. I wonder what this says about how I think about myself. My next video book report will be on this volume, the first of the WRAETHTHU histories, the Wraiths of Will and Pleasure. Hey, I can read backwards. And I'm going to loan this one to my young man I'm cohabitating with, because he saw on this edition of this one that it came very highly regarded by Neil Gaiman, who he's really into. Is it Gaiman or Gaiman? I say Gaiman half the time. How does he pronounce it? Somebody tell me. And so I said, to get an idea of how this is going to read, I would suggest reading this after I finish with it. Maybe I'll do a Q&A with him about how he felt about it. But yeah, alright, sweethearts. Bats and kisses, and I love you all very much. Again, all of my social media jobbies are in the description box below, and you can toss me $1 every month on Patreon. That would be really nice. I would like to buy some Chinese food before the end of the month. I want Chinese food, but I've got $10 in my bank account until the 1st. Oh, well. Alright, bats and kisses. Bye-bye.